Welcome, everybody.
So while Ellen and Ethan are getting things set up between them, I'll do a little introduction. I encountered Ethan when he gave this reading that he's about to give for us for the Berkeley Botanical Garden, the University of California in Berkeley Garden. Ethan is the Museum Scientist and Horticulturalist for the Southern African Collection and the Cycad and Palm collections at the University of California Botanical Garden at Berkeley. He's also the co-author of the book he's about to talk about with his father of this book, The Art and Philosophy of the Garden, which was published this year, meaning last year. And his presentation will cover the major topics addressed in the book, including garden definition, comparisons of gardens to other art forms, whether a garden can be a work of art, and what it means to interpret a garden and contextual matters relevant to garden appreciation. Ethan has experience both at the Berkeley Garden and also at the San Francisco Botanic Garden, where he did an internship. He's also been at Kew Gardens and has lived in Florida. So he's seen a lot of gardens in a lot of places, and he has a fascinating talk for us. So welcome to the California Horticultural Society, Ethan, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Hey, thanks very much. Right, good evening, and thank you so much for having me. I'm going to be talking about this book that I co-authored over the past 4 years called The Art and Philosophy of the Garden, which came out last May from Oxford University Press. The presentation is one, like Jeff was saying, that I gave at the garden that I work at, which is the UC Botanical Garden. And I'm sorry, Jeff, and anyone else who was present, because the jokes don't get any better. This is a book that was written in collaboration between me and my dad, who's a philosophy professor specializing in aesthetics at the University of North Florida. And the whole project got started right around the start of the COVID shutdown, where my dad called and discussed starting on a new line of research, philosophy of gardens. The writing process was a back and forth. He'd write a chapter and send it to me. I'd edit, add, subtract, and send it back to him, and repeat and repeat. Some sections were all him, and a few were all me. This book is a work in philosophy, so it's pretty heavy on theory. It's my first book in the field. In fact, it's my first book, period. And I want to say thank you. Honestly, it means a lot that people would spend part of their evening to listen to our opinions on the subject. Being that this book is just shy of 400 pages, I'm going to try to keep this to about 35 minutes and focus on the bigger picture items. And I'm going to try to stick to the script. Otherwise, I'll get way off. Of course, if you feel like I rushed through any of the topics, I will direct your attention to where you can buy your very own copy. So, first, what is this book all about? Well, like I said, it's a work of philosophy. It's 391 pages, and there are only 12 pictures in black and white. It's not what we would call a beach read, and I'm sorry to say there is no direct discussion of plant species or garden design advice. For those of you that have already lost interest in the book, let me say that, at least for the presentation, I've got some nice color photographs of plants and gardens. So first, a question. Are gardens works of art? Are some gardens works of art? If we say yes to either of those questions, then it would stand that the garden is an art form. And if garden making is an art form, and some gardens are works of art, then gardens as a whole have been massively overlooked in the discussions on art theory and history. This book presents a way to look at gardens as aesthetic or art objects, similar to how we look at paintings, listen to music, and enjoy all other sorts of aesthetic or art objects. And our hope is that this is not just something of an idle academic pontification, but something that is grounded in reality and presents ideas that could enrich our experience of the real gardens around us. So some of the types of questions that we want to address in the book are, is the garden more of an object or an experience? Is the garden more of an art form or a craft? How do we experience a garden's aesthetic properties? Can the garden be read or interpreted? Can a garden possess meaning? And can a garden be evaluated and compared? Here's a picture of the dry garden at Ryoanji in Kyoto, what would appropriately be called karisansui, but in the West is often referred to as a dry garden or Zen garden. Is this a garden? The temple complex had its start in the 1400s, and in the case of Ryoanji, no plants were intentionally planted. Despite this, people have been looking at it, traveling to it, thinking about it, writing about it, and maintaining it for the better part of 600 years. Throughout the book, we refer to this garden and other karisansui as figuring out how these so-called outliers fit into the equation is one of the most illuminating activities in determining the nature of the garden. In fact, our first two chapters are devoted solely to defining the word garden. This might seem like overkill, but when you get into it, you see that many people have very different ideas on what counts and what doesn't. Or they go ahead and talk about gardens like we all implicitly know what we're talking about. What about greenhouses? And karisansui like Ryoanji? It would seem to us that before we define the art form, we must first define the form. Otherwise, we're building our theory on shaky foundation. And even if we can't determine a unified definition, the search for the meaning of words is illuminating in itself. That's our opinion anyway. First up in our search for definition, we look at the first gardens and the etymology of related terms. The words garden, yard, and even the Latin hortus all come from a single Proto-Indo-European word related to enclosure. Enclosure is important in early gardens, likely to protect cultivated area from the elements and from thieves. There are a lot of early gardens or garden-like areas that are notably walled off, such as the Roman peristylum, the medieval Hortus conclusus, and the Persian charbagh, which later became the dominant style of the Islamic world. But gardens today are not all enclosed by walls. The garden I work at is at UCBG, but the garden at my rental house is not. Merriam-Webster's definition of a garden includes no reference whatsoever to enclosure, and it would exclude places like Ryoanji. But it is common to refer to these things as gardens, and if they aren't gardens, well, then we need to find a better word. We come to the conclusion that there is really no definition from history, from etymology, from dictionaries, or from academic sources that includes all that we commonly call gardens, and so we resolve to start from scratch. The bulk of Chapter 1 is devoted to an inventory of all garden styles, all that has been meaningfully referred to as a garden, which ended up being about 13 pages. Some categories we came up with are preservation and collection gardens, identity and style gardens, function-forward gardens, and setting and framing gardens, just to name a few. We also evoke an idea brought to our attention from the garden theorist and historian John Dickson Hunt, who borrowed from Cicero on the idea of the three natures. First nature is untouched wilderness, unadulterated nature, the kind of thing that we'd like to see on a backpacking trip, if such a thing can be said to still exist. Second nature is nature put to human use, but with a strictly utilitarian purpose. Examples would be orchards, farms, nurseries, and vineyards. Third nature is human cultivation of nature that exceeds utilitarian aims. It is the creation of a place with aesthetic considerations. In our search for the meaning of the word garden, we can more or less exclude those things that are either first or second nature. And so this brings us to Chapter 2, our proposed definition of the garden. We have it in 10 points. The first in the set have to do with boundedness, not necessarily enclosure, but spatial delineation. We say that the garden is spatially three-dimensional, geographically bound, and human-scaled and perspectively bound. The second set of points has to do with the garden's relationship with nature, and this is necessarily characterized by change. Gardens are dynamic and time-dependent. They are nature interactive and ecologically bound, and they are unbounded in time and lifespan. By this I mean that gardens are always changing. that their form is determined by the environment in which it sits, and that it has no end date so long as suckers like you and me are willing to maintain it. The third set of points has to do, more or less, with how humans use and relate to gardens. We say that all gardens are designed, human interactive and requiring of maintenance. They are rule governed in one way or another, and they are aesthetically engaging. Of course, the book goes into a lot more discussion of each point, but we claim at the end of the day that all these 10 points are necessary and sufficient conditions, meaning that all gardens must exhibit all points. And there is nothing else that exhibits all of these points and is not a garden. The fun part, for me at least, which we think is interesting, is to try to find counterexamples and garden-like places that really straddle the edges of the definition. And if you find some, email me and we'll include it in the next edition. Okay, moving on from defining the garden, we now turn to how gardens are like art. One of the points in our definition was that gardens are designed to front their aesthetic features. This is a condition for it being third nature. But lots of things have features that we might call aesthetic, including things that are not designed, like first nature. So to be enjoyable to look at is not what makes it art. There are two art theories that we reference: mimesis, where art is made that imitates nature, and expressivism, where art is made to share an idea. It would seem to us that gardens can fit into both of these categories. Even botanical gardens, such as mine, which might not really be trying for art status, certainly attempt to represent environments and express the idea of diversity. And gardens are like other art in that they are created in specific styles and are commonly evaluated and criticized by their audience. I can't tell you how many times I'm working in the garden and overhear aesthetic comparisons between UCBG and SFBG in Golden Gate Park, gardens that are similar in certain regards, but with differences in purpose, scope, and care. Later in Chapter 3, we relate the garden to specific art forms. Gardens are like painting in our attention to painterly concerns such as color, lightness and darkness, movement, and emphasis points. It is like sculpture in its three dimensions, and like chipping away at marble, the garden's aesthetic features are revealed not just by addition, but by subtraction. By this I mean weeding and pruning. Gardens are like architecture in that they are all human-scaled and purposeful, and like many art installations in that they are arrangements of components and might be necessarily site-specific, which, by the way, we claim that all gardens are site-specific. Gardens are like poetry, not just by symbolism it might include, but also by those non-representational aspects, such as meter and pacing. Like in the garden, if we want to slow people down, we put in stepping stones. In a poem, if we want to slow people down, we put in punctuation and longer, stickier words. Gardens are like performance and dance in that the elements are living and dynamic. And it is like music in its inclusion often of rhythm and structure, as well as the sort of non-representational indicators of mood. Moving a song from major chords to minor chords can change the mood, like moving from a sunny hill of annuals into a cool and shady ferndale. And lastly, we find comparisons of gardens to film in that both involve multiple artistic hands, usually of very different disciplines, often with unseen and sometimes uncredited work, to create a single and unified piece of art. In Chapter 4, we address those that have less positive things to say about the garden as an art form, which included, by the way, the philosophers Kant and Hegel. The main arguments are that gardens have insufficient cognitive engagement, that they are just collections of pretty things, that there are too many artists and too many variables to have a unified work, that gardens, like the rest of nature, are constantly changing and sometimes redesigned, and that gardens have purposes beyond aesthetic enjoyment, such as, for example, education of plant ecosystems or walking your dog. At the end of the day, though, we're going to say that the arguments for the garden being an art form outweigh the arguments against. It is true that if gardens are art forms, they are unique. The biggest difference, it seems, is that gardens are not encapsulated in time. They don't have an end date like other time-dependent art like music or dance. And this is the big problem we turn to in Chapter 5. This chapter addresses the problem of garden dynamism and objecthood, and I must say this is probably the most philosophically dense part of the book. To start, there is no fixed object that we can point to and say, this is the garden. It is always, this is the garden right now. And as soon as we say it, the moment is over. The plants have grown some, the sun has set some, and the garden is forever changed. So how do we ascribe aesthetic properties to something we can't point to or hold? And another related problem, how do we frame a scene that is never stable? We have a solution. We say that the garden is an object of experience. So while the physical object that is the garden is always in flux, the subjective experience of the aesthetic features occurs as an event, starting and stopping when we enter and exit the garden. These are phenomenological properties and are in many ways specific to an individual's experience and attention. The phenomenological properties are derived, of course, from the three-dimensional object of the garden, but also from what we call process properties, that which leads to the formal presentation of the garden, but are invisible to us at the time of our visit. So, for example, if anyone has been to the Southern African Collection at UCBG in late March or early April, and I hope that's many of you, because this is my garden, so stop by and say hi. You will have experienced the annual super bloom in the Karoo beds. It looked much different in the summer dormancy period. That's the image on the right, of course. So the appearance of the garden is specific to the time of our visit. The objective properties are the materials, the individual plants and stones and signs and whatnot. The process properties are all the work I do before and during the bloom, such as watering or withholding water, amending the soil, applying fertilizer, thinning the annuals, cutting back the babiana foliage, which is the blue and purple, and of course, lots and lots of weeding. The phenomenological capture occurs when you walk away and hold those elements of the garden specific to that time in your mind's eye. These two pictures are two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. The more experiences we have of the garden in different seasons at different times of day, the more complete our mental picture of the garden becomes, and the more we appreciate the fleeting nature of the garden's elements. And before I move on, you might be able to see that sort of aloe on a stick. That is one of the hybrids of Aloe Hercules that you might have seen at the Ruth Bancroft Garden. That is Aloe dichotoma, but it is too young and in too much of a marginal climate to have branched at this point in its lifespan. So still growing it as an aloe on a stick, and then hopefully by the time I am retired, it will be something worth looking at.
Oh, thanks for pointing that out.
Oh, sure. Appreciating gardens, like any other art, does not mean appreciating its formal qualities alone. In Chapter 6, we turn our attention to those aspects of the aesthetic appreciation of gardens that are not formal, specifically the relevance of context. Context is relevant to the appreciation of all art, gardens included, and in some ways, context might have a great impact on our appreciation of a certain garden. For example, one of the principal contextual matters is knowing the kind of garden that we are looking at. People who come into UCBG and expect a formal alley of trees and bedding plants with seasonal rotation are going to be disappointed no matter what. Those who go to Filoli and expect geographic diversity of rare species are going to be equally disappointed. It helps to know something about the science of plants and the ecology of the site, who paid for it, who owns it, who designed it, and who is maintaining the garden, how it has evolved over time and what sort of resources it uses, how it has been received by its audience, how it relates to the land and the community beyond the garden, and how it relates to other gardens and other works of art. An example is the life cycle of the corpse flower, Amorphophallus titianum. Obviously, it's pretty impressive with just its own formal qualities, especially its appearance and its smell. But our appreciation of the plant is multiplied when we learn that it often does not bloom for years at a time, that it creates heat to volatilize smells and attract pollinators, that the flower is actually a massive collection of male and female flowers, and that in non-flowering years it produces a single towering leaf. That's the kind of scientific context that increases aesthetic appreciation. Another example, on the garden level, is the Highline in Lower Manhattan. Surely on its own, it is an impressive garden, but the more we learn about it, the more we appreciate it. For example, the situational context of being sited in what had been an undervalued part of Manhattan, that it is a park built on an old elevated rail line, that it was designed by Peter Dolph, and like his other designs, showcases a rotating seasonal palette of plants that are allowed to senesce and encouraged to weave naturalistically into one another. We wouldn't get all of this informational value if we were dropped out of a coconut tree into the park without this context. I'm realizing that that joke did not age well. In chapter 7, we ask the question, can we interpret gardens? Interpretation, we can say, is the discovery of meaning. But what do we mean by meaning? As always, we address the arguments for and against. Those who say that the garden cannot be interpreted argue that not all gardens are made with meaning in mind, that some are designed just to be mindlessly pretty. And they say that garden meaning cannot be read from start to finish, that it is not as representational as, say, a novel. We say this is a very narrow view on meaning. Not all art out there can be reduced to its informational components. There is so much music, for example, that has no lyrics, that evokes certain moods and images by its non-representational components alone. We interpret music by how it feels when it's played, and we like to believe that the effect of the song is greater than the sum of its notes. Meaning is all about relating the object to something beyond itself. A garden may mean to communicate, for example, our human relationship with nature and what we believe to be the appropriate level of human influence over the places we inhabit. But perhaps even more basically, all gardens are designed, and each of the many facets of design involves a choice of one thing over another. Why this plant here? Why this kind of path or that kind of bridge? Why is that tree pruned like this and not like that? Design choices indicate that there is some thought put into the purpose of each action and how the result will fit into the aesthetic whole. If our design has meaning, then it stands that visitors can interpret this meaning, whatever it may be. By the way, the image on the right is of Stourhead in Wiltshire in England, which represents on a walk around the lake Aeneas's trip through the underworld. It is one of the cited examples of a garden that does, in fact, have a kind of textual narrative. This is an image of the gardens of the Palace of Versailles, designed by André Lenotte starting in the 1660s. This palace was for Louis XIV, the Sun King, who wanted his palace to stretch to the horizon. The design is highly formal, and the plantings near the palace are low, so as to be seen from the palace windows. We might say that such a design is meant to express a dominion over the landscape, that the ground of the palace is subject to the king. Gardens in England are sometimes formal as well, But around the 1700s, a different idea on gardens began to take hold. Capability Brown is perhaps the most famous garden designer of this period, and designed or redesigned many of the large estates owned by the aristocracy. The scale of some of these was and is on par with Versailles, but the design is very different. Hills and lakes and groups of trees were placed to look like an idealized nature. The boundaries of the garden allowed seamless views into the surrounding countryside, and you might not be able to see it from the picture, but there are some sheep that are wandering in the pasture. We would say that the meaning of a Brownian landscape is to express a sense of pride towards the English landscape and way of life. And that might be something that Jim talks about on his lecture. Now that we've decided that gardens can be interpreted, we turn to the question of how gardens can be interpreted. We base our interpretations on the formal aesthetic features of the garden, what we call garden form. This is the sum of all of the features that we relate to on a garden visit, those that have been provided by nature, as well as those shaped by human caretakers. We can describe it as a kind of rubric to explain why for each design choice. In developing what we believe counts as garden form, we draw comparisons to film form, which, like we said earlier, is also a complex form of art involving many different co-creators. Film form includes the following: a film's narrative, a film's sound, including diegetic and non-diegetic sound, all of the film's various visual components, a film's cinematography, and a film's editing style. In film, we draw meaning from a scene and from a film as a whole when we are able to determine the internal logic of each of these kinds of decisions and how one relates to the other. This is something that we're looking to do in the garden as well. We have 11 points that make up garden form, and we start with path. The path provides the narrative arc of an individual's visit to the garden. It is the tempo of the walk and the choices we make when the path diverges. When someone is talking about the formal aspects of the garden, it is understood that they are talking about them from the point of view of the path. And with this, we include path elements such as gates and benches. Next is structure. Everything in the garden is subject to change eventually, but structure refers to those elements that are designed to be the most stable, including built elements such as buildings and walls, but also hedges in the form of mature trees. Structure provides the bones of the garden, creating spatial delineation. Artifactual elements are all that is designed by humans, such as sundials, sculptures, pink plastic flamingos, where I'm from, railings, etc. The list here is almost endless. Artifactual elements are a good indicator of mood. For example, a serene stone Buddha lends a different tone to a garden than a statue of a peeing boy. Space is the emptiness between all other elements, how open or closed a garden is as we move through it. Water is sometimes present in all gardens. Sometimes this is used as an element unto itself, like fountains, streams, and waterfalls, which cool the temperature of the garden both physically and mentally. Otherwise, we relate to water and how the garden is irrigated and how it drains from high points to low points. Light in the garden, as I'm sure we all know, is not just sun versus shade. There is different light in the morning compared to the evening, which illuminates different garden elements and brings things to our attention that we might have otherwise overlooked earlier in the day. Topography is the amount of elevation change, which affects how tired our legs are, but also the depth of our field of vision. As an example, I got my start in professional gardening at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, in London, which is relatively flat. One of the things I loved on my walk was how I could get pretty decently lost in the grounds, and then round the corner, and all of a sudden, I had a clear view to the Palm House on one end and to the River Thames on the other. It really gave a sense of discovery and perspective. Now, the second garden that I worked in professionally was the New York Botanical Garden in the Bronx. which, like the garden that I work at, currently UCBG is quite hilly. Initially, I was disappointed that I couldn't come upon these same sightlines and the same process of discovery. But climbing to an overlook and seeing the landscape from a different angle made me realize this is the kind of discovery and perspective that a hilly garden provides that a flat garden cannot. Moving on, the next point in garden form is ecology, which is a pretty big one. As we said, all gardens are site-specific and tied to the physical and ecological conditions of the site. Everything from what's in the soil to what migrates through to the kinds of animals we trap or exclude from the garden. And I'll say it includes us as gardeners and garden visitors. When we are in the garden, we are also ecological participants. Setting is something we talk about a lot in the book. It refers to the sights, sounds, and smells of both the natural and man-made context of the garden, the so-called borrowed scenery. Also the terroir of the garden, the microclimates, and what we can grow in a given region. If you take a visit up to UCBG one morning, consider how different the feel would be if we were not cradled on three sides by the canyon, or did not have the view to the city or to the bridge. Okay, last two, we are finally talking about plants. Plant palette are all the choices of what plants and where. This is first determined by the location we're in and access to materials. But after that, the combinations are literally endless. And maybe we want a subtler garden with fewer plants on our palette. I'd say this is where the elements of art come into greatest play, as our planting schemes will want to consider color, texture, movement, rhythm, unity, contrast, value, etc. The last point of garden form is what we call plant character. This refers to those aspects of plants that are innate to the species and difficult, if not impossible, to replicate. For example, mosses that take hold on the twisting branches of a mature oak tree is something that nature lends to the form of the garden. It's an indicator of age and settledness. Many gardens are built, at least in part, by the natural reseeding of plants. The caretaker of the garden must have the vision to maintain those happy accidents, and in some cases, accentuate them. Here's a picture of a roji garden, the type of garden that one passes through on their way to a tea house. One of the dominant features here is the path, made of irregular stepping stones. We can see one bridge element, that's the flat stone at the front, and one gate. Artifactual elements seen here are the great stone lantern and the tea house itself. The materials used for both are natural and muted. The light is low, the space is fairly narrow, and traditionally, the garden would be sprinkled with water before visitors arrive. This picture is from the Portland Japanese garden, and odds are there is an ambient dampness in the air as well. The plant palette consists of small trees, azaleas and rhododendron, with a background of dark conifers, designed to provide contrast and rotating but subtle seasonal interest. The plants are maintained to accentuate their natural character, and of course, the delicate carpet of moss is maintained by weeding and daily sweeping. Looking at the individual elements of garden form, we get a sense that you are meant to take your time as you step and cross through the thresholds. This is a place that suggests subtlety, simplicity, and purity, as if the tea house were in a secret spot miles away. In Chapter 9, we begin to talk about value. We ask the question, do gardens possess only positive value? This takes us into a discussion on garden ethics. Our point of view is that ethical considerations are relevant to art appreciation, and gardens are certainly included. For example, our aesthetic appreciation of a garden might be colored if we knew that a garden were populated with ecologically damaging invasive plants, or if we knew that it required large amounts of resources to maintain in a drought-stricken area. We might have a different opinion on a public garden if we knew how the land were acquired, or if we knew that it explicitly or implicitly excluded certain types of people from visiting. I'm going to leave most of this topic for later, especially considering that my dad and I have another book in the works, specifically on garden ethics that's coming out soon. Let's say soon. But suffice to say that ethics affect our aesthetic perception, and gardens can be compared to one another on both aesthetic and ethical grounds. We say that good garden criticism is based on the formal aesthetic properties of the garden, the non-formal contextual matters, including ethical matters, and the subjective interpretation of the garden's meaning that the critic and others might propose. I want to wind down this presentation by saying that gardens are uniquely enriching art forms, not just in the product, the garden, but also in the process of gardening. For one, gardens and gardening provide a connection with other people, with external nature, and with our own selves. It makes no difference if we are working towards art status or simply enjoying the craft. Gardens and gardening inculcate a number of positive human virtues. This is something that we first read in David Cooper's book, A Philosophy of Gardens. Some garden virtues include care, compassion, respect, self-discipline, patience, humility, and above all, hope. All that we do in the garden relies on hope for the future. Hope that what we will have planted will thrive, that next year will be even better than this one, that the world will be habitable and kind to our garden even long after we have gone. Hope is not necessarily wishing for something to be or passively awaiting a predetermined outcome. Hope is an active and informed bet that we make on the future. There is an implicit optimism in gardening without which we would not be inclined to invest such backbreaking labor. We sow the seeds now because we know, with the right amount of attention and know-how, we can make our corner of the world a little bit better than it was without us. And on that note, we come to the conclusion of the book. What have we learned? We offer a unified definition of gardens in 10 points. We say that gardens are physical objects in constant flux, and that we can think of the aesthetic features of gardens as objects of experience. In chapters 3 and 4, we talk about the similarities and differences gardens have with other canonical art forms. And in chapter 7, we argue that gardens can convey meaning. In chapter 8, we talk about how such meaning can be interpreted, and we offer an account of garden form in 11 points. And finally, we say that gardens can be compared to one another, both aesthetically and ethically. The garden as an art form is perhaps more complex than the art forms we are used to, but I can say that, at least personally, giving serious attention to gardens as an art form has expanded and enhanced my view of the work I do and my view of art in general. And I want to say thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is a picture of Protea cynaroides, which is found in my garden. That's the national flower of South Africa, along with my photo credits, most of from some friends or pictures that I have taken from around my travels. And then I would like to finish off with this slide. Since I'm not present in person, if you would like to purchase the book, there is a promotion code to save 30% there on your screen.
That was terrific. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we need clapping.
You are now responsible for the a portion of the UC Botanical Garden, which has a long history and has been artfully worked on before you. And so I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about how you are approaching it as an artist, shall we say, and what is entailed in your curation of it and care for it and your vision for it.
Yeah, and it's really sort of something that I think about a little bit on a day-to-day basis. One sort of fun fact is that the oldest tree the oldest succession tree in the garden is in my section, which is an Afrocarpus, used to be just called Podocarpus gracilior. And that one was planted in 1928 at the top of the hill. It's the same Podocarpus that you see all over the place as sort of a hedging plant. But it makes you think of who planted that, where did it come from, and all of these other people that have had their hands in the garden along the way. I'm trying to identify a little piece of an oxalis, which was collected by Robert Orndorff, who was the former director of the garden, and just thinking of this was collected several decades before I was born, and I'm growing it now. I'm responsible for it, and then my direct predecessor was Megan Ray, who was working in that garden for quite some time and moved over to another garden and then eventually back to New York. So I see her hand, just sort of speaking from my own personal garden. I see what she has planted and where, and I interpret why she did that. And sometimes it worked out and sometimes it didn't. As in sometimes it feels like she didn't know exactly how big that plant would get in our climate. And so things were getting a little bit overgrown into the path. But I see, where she put emphasis points and that kind of thing. And I think it takes someone who is responsible for sort of an inherited garden to take a step back and look at that more carefully and figure out the intent behind the design choices beforehand, whether it worked out or whether it didn't. I know just as many people who want to accentuate the work of the former artist, gardenist, if we want to call them that. And there's an equal number of people that are actively working to undo the work of their predecessors because they have different tastes or something like that. So yeah, I guess that's sort of how I approach it, at least in my professional life.
Much
So
better.
Ethan, this is Christina Anker Hansen. I have actually worked in that garden as a volunteer when Sean Hogan was there.
Oh, cool.
And I was a young person and very young, and I could do a lot of work, and it just killed me at the time. I will admit that Sean let me have a few, quote, weeds, unquote, to take home because to me, this was a whole new world. I live in Danville. It's hot out where we are. And it's a different climate, but not as different as everyone thinks. And I find it interesting what you say because I I don't know if I would agree with everything you and your father had concluded.
Mhm.
I have an art collection as well, and I was just discussing it with my friend here that I like kinetic art, which is, I just shared something on Facebook, which is a sculpture that you might not even think of as a sculpture, but it is a platform that gives off a wind, and there are three pieces of fabric that are very long and flying around and fall. And to me, it's interactive because at one point, one of the fabric, it was in an office, a building with a high ceiling in the hall, and a piece of the fabric fell down, and the person who walked by just took it and threw it back up, and that makes the art very interactive to me.
Mhm.
And I was very instrumental in getting the Ruth Bancroft's light show going.
Oh, cool.
And because one of my biggest fascinations is art as light or light as art.
Mhm.
And one of the criticisms of it the first year we did it was because we have to do it during the darkest time of year, obviously, in order to, I mean, you can't have anything after 9 o'clock and it's in a neighborhood. And this guy was complaining, why wasn't I doing Christmas lights? Or we were doing Christmas lights. And I said, well, this is not about Christmas. And he was appalled. And he said, well, why are you doing it this time of year? And I said, because it's dark. And his wife was with him and she said, oh, yeah. So people don't, I mean, to me, gardens are also about being aware of time,
Mhm.
which I can't tell you how many people, and I used to be a garden designer, did not know where east, west, south, and north were in their yard. They had no relationship with their environment. They had no concept. They had no concept that the days are, what? I think they get as short as 10 hours of light in the
Mhm.
winter. and as long as 16 hours in the summer. So art to me is not just about somebody's feeling, but about awareness of yourself and your environment.
Right.
And a garden makes you aware in so much more than just the pretty plant or the layouts of the paths. It is also about your interaction with nature. Even though you're in controlled environment that you have created, you're still out there in nature. Face it. You know,
Mhm.
my kids tell me when I die, the house will be sold and raised and the garden will disappear. And I'm okay with that because I'll be dead and I won't care.
Mhm.
But but I can't, there are people who come by all the time. I've had photographs taken, movies taken of the garden, people who just love to come and see it because I pride myself in having bloom year round in an environment where nobody does.
Mhm.
And to me, all of that is art.
Oh yeah.
It's
Well,
interaction with nature and human beings. It's international with interaction with art and human beings. It's interaction with light and human beings. So I don't know that I find your attempts at trying to define the
uh-huh.
garden as art limiting.
Why is that? Because you just said that the garden, that your garden, you feel is
But
has
it's my
artistic
feeling.
value.
It's
That's your
my
feeling.
feeling.
Well, this is our
Right.
feeling.
No,
Yeah.
I realize that.
Yeah.
But you're not talking about, well, your book, I'm sure, is art too, because philosophy to me is also art. But it's how I'm sure there are words for it, and I'm not getting them. But um, when you're talking about a subject like you are, now you're getting into what I view as a controlled situation. You're trying to control it for a way to understand it.
Uh-huh.
Right.
And all I'm doing is sitting here going, why do you want to try to do that to people?
Yeah. Well, I feel like any language, any communication is just a way to convey your opinions and make it into a
Right.
structured way. And I feel like I really appreciate this you bringing this up because I think this is great of conveying what your garden means to you in your words. And I will admit, my father is much more wordier than I am. I'm a gardener. I feel like progress is being made when my hands are in direct contact with the soil and how many weeds are being plucked out at the end of the day. My father is an analytic philosopher. And so talking about all of this kind of stuff and putting it down into words and delineating what counts and what doesn't, that's his day job. That's all I can say is
Yeah, no, I understand.
yeah.
And I actually admire you
Yeah.
in that you're able to work with him.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That is something because he must be frustrated at times with you for not seeing the world as he sees it necessarily. I mean, you can see it, but you
Mhm.
probably aren't all there for him, which nobody is all there for anybody. So
Yeah.
don't worry about that part. But I just,
But
as
what
I had to say, go
Yeah,
ahead.
but what an
Yeah.
interesting partnership of the two.
Yeah,
Like you said, it could be frustrating, but it
Right.
can be beautiful when you
yeah,
can try to take these two different ways of thinking and
Mhm.
put it together and what you can create from the two differences there.
Yeah.
right.
My takeaway is you're talking about more of like a direct experience of the piece of the piece of the art of the garden.
Right, but
Yeah.
isn't all art interpretive that way? I
Yeah.
mean,
Oh,
I
yeah.
collect McDonald's figures too. I collect everything. You can ask people who've been here.
Sure.
I have a friend, Martin Grantham, who used to work at
Oh,
the
yeah.
garden, and he and I got into it because I had something from The Hunchback of Notre Dame
Mhm.
on my fireplace shelf, where along I had a bunch of other very quote serious art, and he was appalled that I juxtaposed it.
Uh-huh.
And I said to him, but Martin, somebody created that. Granted, they made multiple mass pieces of it, but still it's art.
Mm-hmm.
And to this day, we don't agree, but that's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
okay.
But
Well, this is what
that's what
moves the
makes art,
conversation.
you know? It's a talking point. It's a difference of an
Yeah.
opinion and what one person finds beauty in, someone might not like. And how boring it would be if we all liked the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like
yeah,
I've been to Versailles many times. I lived near it for a month at one point. I have no desire to go back and see it.
I'm right there with you. Yeah.
It's kind, I mean, if you've been to the house too, I mean, you realize that I took my kids there when they were young, and I promised them after we did Versailles that we'd go to the French Disneyland.
Mhm.
And it was interesting because we went to Versailles and then we went to French Disneyland the next day. And I thought Versailles was Disneyland at the time.
Mm.
Only the wealthy could have it. Now many more people can have it, but
Mhm.
it was still Disneyland.
Yeah. Yeah. And I kind of refer to certain gardens that I've been to as kind of Disneyland-esque gardens of you're just sort of walking around and you're hitting the stops and then you're heading out, that kind of thing. And it's there's no depth to it. Yeah. So,
But I have to tell you, I found the film Avatar utterly fascinating.
Uh-huh.
I would love it if we had plants that did that at night. I have tried to create an avatar garden in my own, but I dragged my husband to Disney World to see the Avatar exhibit. He thought I was nuts. And he made me do the ride, which was not what I was interested in, but I was so impressed with how they created the light and the plants outside of the ride
Mhm.
because they were able to capture, I mean, Cameron, I can't remember his name now, the guy who did it
yeah.
all on computers.
Mhm.
And so there was nothing out there, and they were able to create it and create an avatar garden, which blew me out of the water because I had to see how I wish they made lighting like that for us, quite frankly.
That's
But
really cool.
it is cool.
Yeah.
Like if you ever had, well, you lived in Florida. I don't know if you ever went. Most people just go Disneyland,
Yeah.
but if you have an opportunity to go back,
Sure.
oh,
Kind of see it. And the one thing, was it Cameron, David Cameron?
James Cameron.
James
Yeah,
Cameron.
there you go. Yeah, there's a whole like list of the plants that were used, and even though they're sort of fake plants, they're made up plants. He's done the whole like list of what they are, where they grow, and what they're used for, sort of thing. Just in like people that are making like fantasy languages will have like the full language. He's done the
Of the
same.
plant, he actually named all the plants that he created and everything. I
Some of
didn't.
them were given like names, like this is Cycad, and which is obviously a plant that exists,
Right.
or a group of plants. But he's done the work, or I don't know, him in particular or his design crew, done the work to describe the species, so to speak.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you should look it up. Try and find it.
Yeah, I think there's so much more out there. And again, and I think there is so much more to come in art, and that's what makes art art.
Yeah.
Because I often think the artist sees things before even the scientist. And that's why Da Vinci
Mm.
was so phenomenal,
Mhm.
because he was an artist and saw things that nobody saw.
Right.
Art is definitely subjective for sure.
Yeah.
Oh.
I think the way you've put out all the steps and stuff, I think is a great way for people to look at, especially designers, different aspects of how to put a garden together and all the kind of different elements that you can have in it and you may want to put in or not. It's what you want it to do and want it to represent.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess like in writing this, and we use the phrase, have spilled a lot of ink on the subject, which is to say, like, we've moved this away from a sort of a direct experience of being in the garden towards something that is very, especially that whole like the 4-dimensional garden that becomes the phenomenological object of experience sort of thing. That gets a little convoluted, doesn't it? But we are trying to bring gardens to the table, I suppose, in writing this, with the background that gardens have been discounted from the art world since the time of Kant and Hegel. We are trying to give it that sort of philosophical oomph, as to say, this is how art is criticized, and this is how gardens can be criticized. and evaluated and intended. And I think that's something new.
Great. Anybody else have any comments or questions?
Yeah. I noticed that you didn't have any photographs of that fellow, is it Chihuly, or who does the glass
Yeah.
things in the garden? I'm
yeah.
not, I feel like that is just so weird. It detracts, in my opinion, from the garden. But,
Yeah.
A lot of gardens buy into it and put exhibits of his stuff. And
Right.
anyway,
I was working at the New York Botanic Garden when we had the Chihuly exhibit. And at the time, that summer was the most visitorship the New York Botanic Garden ever
is that
received.
right?
Yeah.
Wow.
And so I was a horticulture student while I was there. And obviously I didn't care about Chihuly, I mean, I was there for the plants, right?
Right.
We all are. And the people though that came in were so rude, let me say. And there is something about integrating art and artifactual elements into your garden design that is positive. There is another thing of using someone else's creation as a backdrop. And I feel like that Chihuly exhibit, to some extent, was placing objects in the garden because it looked good on a field of green. And a lot of gardens, unfortunately, public gardens are, they have to do the dog and pony show to keep themselves afloat. Even orchid shows and things like that.
Yeah.
It's big business. And they,
Yeah.
So.
Well,
I'm also interested to know how you think, how you are applying ethics to the garden. Maybe this is a lead in for your next book.
Well, we talked a little bit about, can gardens, harm people? What are the ethics of land ownership, of resource use, of that kind of thing? We talk a little bit about, like, I'm working on a chapter right now on guerrilla gardens, and was it ever ethical to impose your design wishes on something that you don't own? Even if it's to benefit the plants, or even if it's to benefit, even public safety or something like that. So those are some of the ethical considerations, I suppose, that we look through, and that sort of thing.
I don't know. Is that it?
When we were in New Zealand, there was a plant that normally grows on volcanic surfaces, and it has really sticky flowers, and so it holds on to the plants or the birds, and the birds die, and the birds fall to the ground, and they make fertilizer for the plant. So that was kind of an ethical thing to eat. And there was a variegated variety that looked really gorgeous, and that people were starting to use it in landscapes, and it's like, that's not ethical. These birds.
Yeah. It's hard to ascribe a sense of moral agency to plants, though, I suppose.
Yeah. Does anybody else have anything else for Ethan, or any other questions? Or Ethan, do you have anything else?
Oh, that's it for me.
Okay, I have two little things. You talked about the A line on your talk, or you had a picture of the A line, and
the High line, yeah.
What is it? High line?
High line, yeah.
High line. And there's going to be a Tilda Botanic Garden lecture series, had one on that, but I didn't bring it up. So if you're interested in that might be there. Anything else? All righty. Thank you, Ethan, so much for your information on your book. We'll have to go check that out, and appreciate all your time. And thank you, everybody, for coming to the meeting. And I'm sorry about the snafu about the in-person one. So take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.